There is a specific kind of person most people have encountered at least once. Someone who told a story, and you knew with some certainty that the story was not true. And yet as you watched them tell it, you noticed something that did not make sense. They were not nervous. There was no hesitation, no micro-expression of guilt, no gap between what they were saying and how their body was carrying it. They were telling you something that was not true with the complete physiological signature of someone telling the truth. Because, for them, it had become the truth. Not because they had forgotten what actually happened, but because the brain, over time, had done something far more specific than forgetting. It had replaced the original record with the version that had been told often enough to become real. This is not a rare phenomenon. It is not the exclusive territory of pathological liars or sociopaths. It is what the brain does, under the right conditions, to almost anyone. A 2021 study published in Nature Neuroscience demonstrated that the amygdala, the brain's primary emotional alarm system, shows a measurably diminished response to dishonesty the more frequently that dishonesty is repeated. The first lie costs something. The brain registers the conflict between what is true and what is being said. The anterior cingulate cortex fires. Error detection, conflict monitoring, the neural experience of cognitive dissonance. The second lie costs less. The third, less still. With sufficient repetition, the brain begins to process the constructed version of events through the same neural pathways it uses to process genuine memory. The lie is no longer stored as a deviation from the truth. It is stored and retrieved as the truth itself. At that point, the person is no longer lying to you. They are telling you what they genuinely believe happened. And the problem this creates for the people in their lives is that no amount of confronting them with evidence will reach the thing that was originally true, because they no longer have access to it. Welcome to Dr. Cole's Dark Psychology. I'm Dr. Evan Cole, behavioral psychologist and behavioral analyst. In video 7, we examined gaslighting, how a person systematically rewrites someone else's memory. In video 8, we examined narcissism, a self organized around the management of a wound it cannot acknowledge. Today, we examine the third version of the same mechanism. What happens when the brain rewrites its own record, not to deceive someone else, but to protect itself from the cost of knowing what actually happened? Self-deception, the neuroscience of how a lie becomes a belief, and what that transformation means for everyone who exists in relationship with someone who has undergone it. A precise distinction before we go further. Self-deception is not the same as ordinary lying. Ordinary lying requires the simultaneous maintenance of two versions of reality, what is true and what is being said. That maintenance is effortful. The brain registers the gap. The anterior cingulate cortex monitors the conflict between the two. That conflict is what produces the physiological signals of deception, elevated heart rate, micro-expressions, the cognitive load that makes lying detectably different from truth-telling. Self-deception is what happens after that gap closes, not because the person has forgotten the truth, but because the brain, through a specific and well-documented process of neural repetition, has stopped maintaining the original version as primary. The person who is genuinely self-deceived is not working to maintain a lie. They are not managing the gap between truth and story. The gap is gone, and what replaced the truth is now indistinguishable from inside the brain that holds it, from what actually happened. The mechanism begins with what researchers call the amygdala's dishonesty signal. When a person tells a lie, particularly in the early stages, before the pattern is established, the amygdala generates an alarm response, not the full threat activation of fear. Something subtler, the emotional cost of saying something that the brain knows to be incongruent with what it holds as true. That alarm is the thing people describe as guilt, discomfort, the sense that something is not right with what they just said. It is not a moral response. It is a neural one. The amygdala detecting a conflict between stored reality and expressed reality. Here is what the 2021 Nature Neuroscience research confirmed. That amygdala response decreases with every repetition of the dishonesty, not because the person becomes more morally comfortable with lying, but because the brain, whose primary function is efficiency, begins to reduce the processing cost of the repeated pattern. The alarm diminishes, the conflict signal weakens, and the constructed version of events begins to settle into memory without the neural flag that marked it as constructed. The prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex, the regions responsible for executive control, error detection, and the monitoring of conflict between competing versions of reality, are heavily engaged the first time a lie is told. Lying is measurably more cognitively effortful than telling the truth. Neuroimaging studies consistently demonstrate this. More brain regions activate, more resources are consumed. The cognitive signature of deception is detectable precisely because it costs more. That cost decreases with practice. Research on what is called deception efficiency shows that experienced liars recruit these regions less, not more. The brain has learned the pattern. The executive control system no longer needs to work as hard to produce and maintain the constructed version. And at a certain point along that trajectory, the point at which the constructed version has been told, recalled, and emotionally experienced enough times, it moves from the category of things the brain knows to be fabricated to the category of things the brain simply knows. Self-deception does not happen equally across all lies or all people. The research identifies 3 conditions under which a constructed version of reality is most likely to fully replace the original. The first condition is emotional necessity. The original truth carries a cost: shame, guilt, responsibility, the confrontation with a version of the self that is incompatible with how the person needs to see themselves. The lie, by contrast, is survivable. It preserves the self-concept that the truth would damage. When the motivation to not know the truth is sufficiently strong, the brain assists with the not knowing. The second condition is repetition. A story told once is a story. A story told to 20 people across 10 years with consistent emotional investment has been rehearsed into the memory system through the same mechanisms that consolidate genuine experience. The hippocampus does not reliably distinguish between an event that happened and an event that has been vividly reconstructed enough times. The third condition is social confirmation. When the people around a person accept and reinforce the constructed version of events, when nobody challenges the story, when the narrative goes externally uncontested, the brain receives confirmation that its record is accurate. Social validation is one of the most powerful consolidators of memory. Real or constructed. The person who left a relationship that they damaged and who, years later, describes themselves as the one who was abandoned, not because they are consciously rewriting the story, because the version they have told to friends, to new partners, to themselves at 3 a.m., has been processed so many times it is now what they find when they reach into memory. The parent who was not present during critical years of a child's life, who now remembers themselves as having been there, as having been attentive, as having done their best in difficult circumstances, when the evidence held by everyone else in the family tells a different story. The colleague who took credit for someone else's work, and who now genuinely remembers the idea as their own, not because they have strategically maintained a lie, because the brain resolved the conflict by revising the record. In each of these cases, confronting the person with the original facts reaches nothing, because what you are confronting is not a lie being consciously maintained. You are confronting a memory, and the person experiencing it has no access to the fact that it was ever anything else. This is the part of the video that matters most to the person watching, who has spent time trying to make someone acknowledge something they will not acknowledge. When a person has genuinely self-deceived, when the constructed version has fully replaced the original in their memory, they are not withholding the truth from you. They do not have the truth to withhold. This means several things that are important to understand. Confrontation will not work the way you expect it to. The evidence you present, the texts, the timelines, the witnesses, will be experienced by them not as revelation, but as attack. Because from inside their memory, they are telling the truth, and you are telling them that their memory is wrong. The brain's response to that experience is not reconsideration, it is defense. The more evidence you present, the more entrenched the self-deception often becomes. Not because they are choosing to resist the evidence, but because the threat to the self-concept that the constructed version protects activates the same defensive architecture as any other existential threat. The question the research raises, and does not fully answer, is whether genuine self-deception can be reversed. The evidence suggests that it can, under conditions that are difficult to manufacture and impossible to force. The self-deception is protecting something, a self-concept that the original truth would damage, a version of the self that the person has organized their entire identity around being. For the constructed version to give way, the person would need to develop sufficient psychological safety to sustain the contact with what the truth actually costs them. That is not something that can be produced by confrontation. It requires, in most cases, a therapeutic relationship over time, and a degree of internal security that most people who have built significant self-deception structures have specifically because they do not have. The honest clinical position is this. If someone in your life has genuinely arrived at the point where the lie has become the memory, you cannot confront them back to the truth. You can only decide what it means for you to be in a relationship with someone whose record of shared experience is fundamentally different from your own. The reason self-deception matters, beyond the specific relationships it damages, is what it reveals about the nature of memory itself. Memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction, rebuilt each time it is accessed, shaped by the emotional needs of the person doing the rebuilding, vulnerable to the same processes that produce any other change in the brain. The person who has never deliberately constructed a false memory is not immune to this process. They are simply someone whose emotional needs have not yet required it at sufficient intensity. The brain is not a truth-preserving instrument. It is a survival instrument. And when the truth becomes a threat to the self that needs to survive, the brain will, without deliberation, without malice, without any conscious decision, make the adjustment, and then remember having always seen things this way. If that changes how you understand a dynamic you have been inside, that is the work this channel exists to do. Subscribe to Dr. Cole's Dark Psychology every week, the neuroscience beneath the behavior, the mechanism underneath the pattern, the thing that is actually happening inside the situation that feels impossible to understand from the outside. No labels, no lists, the science of why people do what they do, even when what they do makes no sense. We'll see you in the next one.